My name is John Cox. I'm a former licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg. It is very difficult to become a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg. I saw that there's a new Civil War magazine that just came out, and they said that it's harder to become a guide than it is to get into Harvard. And I believe that's so. You have to take a written examination that lasts about 4 hours. Has essay questions, multiple choice, true and false, a really detailed test about the Battle of Gettysburg and about the Civil War. And after you take that test, you're ranked where you score first, second, third. And as battlefield guide positions become available, and most people do not give up being a guide until they die, then you can come for an oral examination. And you have to do a 2-hour tour of the battlefield because normal tours are 2 hours. You have to do a 2-hour tour with a veteran licensed battlefield guide and usually a park historian, and they can ask you any question they want. And it's very difficult. Even people that score very high on the written test fail the oral. I believe I took the test in 1998, and it was an 85% failure rate at that time. Now I understand more people are failing the oral exam than ever before, so they've made the oral even tougher, so it's very difficult. You got to know your stuff. I have spent so many hours on the battlefield at Gettysburg. I have been over every inch of it. And the Battle of Gettysburg, the battlefield itself, I think it encompasses a 30-mile area. So I've trucked over fields, through the woods, through the streams, and up the hills and down the valleys, and I've covered about every inch of it. Gettysburg is, at this point, Gettysburg is a part of me. I can't get away from it even if I wanted to. And I just think Gettysburg was a turning point in our nation's history. So it's important to our nation, not just to me, because I'm really confident that if the Battle of Gettysburg didn't turn out the way that it did, none of us get to live the lives that we live today. That's how important Gettysburg was, and it's always been really meaningful to me. Minnesota played a significant role in the Battle of Gettysburg. Normally, you can read books or read veterans' accounts, and they always say, if it wasn't for our charge or our stand, the battle could have never been won. But that's truly the case with the 1st Minnesota. What happened late in the afternoon on July 2nd, if those Minnesota boys don't make that charge, things are going to be really different for our nation. It's extremely important. There's no doubt about it that charge by the 1st Minnesota boys on July 2nd saves the nation, no doubt in my mind. On July 2nd, General Dan Sickles moves forward out of the Union Fishhook battle line that General Meade has created. And by moving forward, he opens up a gap in the Union line. And from that point on, General Hancock and General Meade are throwing reinforcements as fast as they can to fill that gap. And there comes a time when there's 1,200, 1,400, 1,500 rebels coming to a mile-long gap in the line. Reinforcements are at least 5 miles away. It's great confusion on the field. And Hancock rides over to the Minnesota boys. Numbers are disputed, just under 300 men, and he gives the order to charge. And the nation is very lucky in the Army of the Potomac that it was the Minnesota guys there, because they were truly, they used to be called a regiment with a reputation. And they had proved themselves on many battlefields. And I think if you had a rookie regiment there, they're not going to be able to do it. So the Minnesota boys, stood strong. They charged. All accounts say they maintained the best line they could, and went right into the rebels and sacrificed themselves. Only veterans could do that. Well, like all things in the Battle of Gettysburg, we have to go on the veterans' account. So if you ask one veteran what happened, it's going to be different from what another veteran has. So we don't really know. We don't really know anything. We can just piece some sort of things together and interpret it, the best that we can. But it seems that the men were already in line when General Hancock rides up. By the way, the confusion was so much, Hancock thought that the units coming towards him were Union. And so he rushed out there with an aide, and they started shooting at him, and that, you know, was clearly, they were the enemy, they were the Confederates. So when he rode over to the Minnesota men, they were already in line. A lot of men said bayonets fixed, and I think they started just marching, and then the pace quickened to double quick till finally it was a jog and a charge. They never really went hand to hand. They got it down in that valley of Plum Run. Certainly they were losing men as they went. They were taking fire. Then they got down into that Plum Run Valley. There's a lot of rocks and, you know, scrub bushes and whatever. Took whatever cover they could, and they began to get surrounded, taking like extreme fire. But, you know, they stood their ground and gave as good as they got. They faced Alabama Brigade commanded by Cadmus Wilcox, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, I think 14th Alabama. The charge of we'll say the advance of the Confederates was not so organized either. They had been fighting for about a mile. So probably the 8th Alabama, maybe parts of other regiments were not with them. So it wasn't the entire brigade. But we can also say there were some Mississippi boys and probably some Florida men that also joined in on the attack. So, you know, numbers are never really accurate. 12, 1,400, maybe 1,500 men came at them. Colonel Colvill, well, one thing, if we met Colonel Colvill today, he was a huge guy. He's about 6'5", well over 200 pounds, well liked by the men. Tilly Pierce, because after Colvill's wounded, he's going to stay at the Pierce family house. I understand a lot of people on the trip after the whole tour was over got some time to go to the Pierce family house. She talked about him being one of the strongest and bravest men of the Army, and she gives a great account of Colonel Colvill. He became part of the Pierce family, and he said, you know, I'll come back and visit. And she wrote, you know, many years later, she was a teenage girl, that she felt a hand on her back and then someone kissing her forehead, and she knew it was the big, strong colonel from Minnesota. So Colonel Colvill is a big guy. You know, he's like me. He was from the East Coast. He came from New York. Like many of the guys in the Minnesota, you know, they weren't Minnesota born. He came out here, started a new life, you know, frontier, you know, rugged individual, started a newspaper business. Probably had, you know, for that time, a little bit of wealth. So, you know, got an officer's rank in the regiment, had very little military experience. So moved up the ranks as things went, well respected and well liked by the men. What's left of the Minnesota regiment after the second day, there's not many of them left. Of course, two of the companies with the regiment were on other duty during the day. So I'm sure it had to be, well, you know, they had things to do too. They went back out across the fields to find their wounded and their dead. That's when Colonel Colvill's found. You know, he's been wounded twice. So, you know, they have duties. I'm sure they rounded up some of the rebel dead also. But it's hard to imagine, you know, that these guys have lost like their best friends. And of course, you know, the Minnesota men, you know, Gettysburg's a long way from Minnesota, even today, and probably more so for them back then. So then being in the Eastern Army and Western men, probably a lot of the Minnesota boys thought they'd never get home. And so I'm sure there was a great deal of sadness if they had time to think about it. But, you know, they had to have soldiers' duties, rounding up the dead and wounded, probably scrounging for something to eat. The wagon trains with the rations hadn't arrived yet. They had outmarched their rations. So probably doing what soldiers, you know, do. And I'm sure a lot of them cracked a couple of jokes to try to take the load off and whatnot. But sure it was a sad moment because there wasn't many of them left. And of course, those two companies overnight are going to rejoin the regiment. Probably puts them up to about 150 men for the third day. And they're put in the center of the line, the worst place to be, because Pickett's charge is going to happen the following day. For Robert E. Lee, this was it. Lee knew that invading the North, this was how he was going to win the war for the Confederacy. He couldn't continue the way that he was doing because he was winning the battles but losing the war. He couldn't replace the losses in manpower and equipment that he had after winning each of the preceding battles. So he's attacked the Yankees for 2 days. He's hit them on the flanks on the second day. He's worn them down, and he thinks, you know, one more attack ought to do it. So the United States of America is at stake. It really is. There's no doubt about it. Because if Lee wins this battle, I mean, who knows? You know, we're not living the way that we are today. So everything's at stake. And the Union Army, for the first time, for 2 days, they have held Lee off, and they've done their duty. They've made their stand. I think one of the big things that Lee forgot was the Union Army was fighting on their home turf. And throughout wars, men have always fought harder defending their homes. And so the Union Army was, making their stand. I'm sure that kid from Minneapolis knows that if Lee gets by him today, he's marching to his home, and that's it. He's at it. So the Union Army is really, they've toughened themselves up, and they're ready. Minnesota men found themselves right smack in the middle of Pickett's charge. They're about 200 yards south of the clump of trees and the famous angle that Lee's aiming for. So they are right in the heart of the action, the place where you really don't want to be. Pickett's charge is Lee's final attempt to destroy the Union Army. He's got 9 brigades, equivalent of about 12 to 13,000 men. He's trying to puncture a hole right through the center of the Union fishhook battle line and win the war. And it's a desperate times, and it's a desperate measure, and it's a desperate attack. He's going for the win. He's pounded them for 2 days. The Union Army of the Potomac has always run. It's a real shock attack. Lee believes that after he pounds the line for about an hour, 2 hours with his artillery and sends these 12 to 13,000 men over, that the Union Army is going to break and run, and he's going to win the war. What happened is the Union Army is, they're beat up, but they're not beaten. And they're going to make a tremendous stand. It's really, in military terms, it's really a column versus a line. And as long as column has numbers of about 3 to 1, and Lee has about 13,000 to about 5,500 Union troops guarding this position in the center of the line. So if the column can break through the line, it can win. Now a line can win if it can flank the column or to hit them in the sides. And what happens is the Union Army executes a classic double envelopment and hits the Pickett's charge from the flanks of both sides, gets it caught in a semicircle. Some of the Vermont men that wheel out, about 1,200 Vermont men are going to fire around 12,000 rounds into the right flank of Pickett's charge in about 5 minutes. And no troops can withstand that. But amazingly, there is a gap in the line for a few minutes. The Confederates do break through the line. Brigadier General Lewis Armstead breaks through with maybe 300 men. And so there's a moment there when the battle is in doubt, and that's where the 1st Minnesota comes in. Since the Confederates have moved forward in this column formation to make a point or a spearhead to attack in the center of the line, their line grows smaller as they move forward. And so the Minnesota men on the left have no one to shoot at. But once this gap opens in the middle by the clump of trees, the 1st Minnesota boys are ordered to rush in and charge into the clump of trees to, again, plug another gap in the line. And they do so very effectively, very effectively. Gettysburg is just about 8 or 9 miles north of the Maryland line. It's to the west of Gettysburg is a series of rolling hills, very gently rolling hills. That's where the Confederates come in on. South of the town of Gettysburg is where the higher ground is. The famous places, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, Little Round Top. So it's a very different area than Virginia. A lot more rocks. It's volcanic activity from years ago has left it little round top Devil's Den, very rocky areas to the south portion of the battlefield, very difficult terrain for the Confederates to maneuver on. And Gettysburg, it's a small town. Today it's only about 7,500 people. It was about 2,300 people at the time of the battle. It's the county seat for Adams County. Not the best place to fight a battle. Once the Union Army gets that high ground south of the town, they're able to dig in and build that fishhook battle line, the upside down, backwards J, and Lee is, not able to break that line. The Battle of Gettysburg is called a meeting engagement, where both sides kind of accidentally on purpose run into each other. They're roaming around the south central Pennsylvania countryside, and it seems inevitable that they would end up at Gettysburg, because Gettysburg, 10 roads lead to the town. It's like the spokes on a wheel. And with these armies marching, all about, it just seems that they would end up where all the roads collide. And, but it does kind of happen by accident, and Lee seems caught off guard. Here he is, this master of war, and he stumbles into the Union Army, and it's really because his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, is off on one of the most famous horse rides in American history, doing a raid in the rear of the Union Army, but he's not out front, scouting, giving Lee that intelligence that he needs. And Lee runs into the Union Army on July 1st, and then everything explodes. I have some contrary opinions about Lincoln's reaction after the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln is disappointed because on July 4th, Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last stronghold of the Confederacy, surrenders on the Mississippi River. And Lincoln felt that if Meade could have just destroyed Lee's army at Gettysburg, it would have ended the war. But I think Lincoln is totally wrong about this, because Meade couldn't. His army was as beat up as Lee's army, and he was a wounded animal. And Lee's force, the Army of Northern Virginia, is still very powerful. And so I think if Meade had not been so cautious or whatever, and attacked Lee there by Falling Waters, Maryland, when Lee's trying to get across the Potomac, I think Lee would have whooped him at that spot. If you ever go down there and look at the trenches that the Confederates dug and whatnot as they were trying to cross the Potomac River, I think Lee would have gave him a beating and marched right back up to Gettysburg and towards Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So Lincoln is very, disappointed in Meade, but he shouldn't have been, because it is a great victory now in hindsight. 150 years later, when we look back, we can see Gettysburg is the turning point. But Lincoln in the situation did not feel that way. He thought it was a lost opportunity. I guided on the battlefield at Gettysburg for a decade, and I took thousands and thousands of people around from all over the world. And so I know, and people say, oh, that was a great tour you gave, John. But I know that the battle never changes. I can never say the Confederates win, because they didn't. So the battle remains the same. So to have a great tour, you have to have great people. And the Minnesota tour, the people all wanted to be there so much. That was a great tour. And it was a great tour because they made it a great tour, because they helped me get excited. There was a lot of questions. People were really active. And, well, they're Minnesotans, so that's, it had to be great. Ironically, there's a lot that gets missed at Gettysburg. The civilians have not been written about enough. What they endure, living in their cellars for 3 days, and the horrors that they may face. A lot of the actions, there's a lot of tremendous cavalry fights, small engagements that happen all around the main battlefields that don't get talked about a lot. I think Colvill, even though there's been books written about that, and I wrote one of them, Colvill doesn't get talked about enough. I think the stand on July 2nd by General George Sears Green, if he doesn't do that, the battle's lost then. So there are still, many things, and, we're still discovering things. And So, there's still a little bit left to learn about Gettysburg. Gettysburg, the aftermath of Gettysburg is the real horror story of the battle. Lee leaves with a wagon train of wounded that stretches for 17 miles, but he leaves at least 8,000 wounded still that the townspeople have to take care of. The Union Army only leaves small details of people, and then the Christian Commission comes in, and civilian sightseers come in, and it's got to be a horror story. That the residents talked about. I always like to say, after the rebels invade Gettysburg and leave, then flies invade, because there's these big green flies start to take over the field, and they say whole rail fences can't be seen because of the flies, and it's really a miracle that pestilence doesn't set in and just kill everyone within 30 miles. People say they get within a few miles of the battlefield and they start to vomit just from the stench, because after all, it is the heat of July and whatnot, and there's just thousands of dead left, thousands of dead horses. There's always been a rumor that there's one of the fields at Gettysburg that the Union soldiers that are left behind take the dead animals and mules or the wounded, and they put them down in this field. And so you think with all the dead horses and dead people, it's had to be an incredible nightmare what the armies leave at Gettysburg. That's an amazing thing. Why people still want to go back to Gettysburg. Gettysburg is part of the American psyche. It happened when, and if you're an American, you have to look at it. This is what we did. It's probably not the smartest of things, Americans killing Americans, but we did it. And Gettysburg, a lot of people say, the Civil War was won in the Western theater or whatnot, but Gettysburg still, and I think rightly so, gets the attention. It's just part of us. It's part of who you are as an American, and I think it should always be. And it's part of being a citizen of the United States is knowing a little bit of something that happened at Gettysburg. It's important to our nation. But I'm a fan of Robert E. Lee. I still am, and it's hard to be a fan of Robert E. Lee and be a Battlefield Guide at Gettysburg, because it is not his best battle. But he was a tremendous man, I think a genius, probably could have been as successful at anything he wanted to do. He chose a career in the military, perhaps to follow in his father's footsteps. And Gettysburg, he certainly has his problems, and he's not in great health. We know today that he probably had a heart attack in April 1863. So even though the weather is very hot and humid, Lee is said to keep his overcoat on and buttoned up to the top button. And it's just, not his best battle. I mean, but even Lee said in the end, things turned out for the best. So Robert E. Lee has got to be still, my favorite character at Gettysburg, even though it's not his best battle, not his best moments. I've written 2 books. I've written Cope's Hill, The Attack and Defense of the Union Right Flank on July 2nd, 1863, and my new book, Gettysburg, A History for the People. It's a book that is really a lifetime of research for me. Took me many, many years to write it. All the stories I've collected over all the years of guiding at Gettysburg. And I really wanted to write a book that appealed to the general public, to the common person on the street, and but it also had a few new things, maybe for someone who is an authority on the battle. And so I took all the sources I had together and pieced it all together and wrote, I think, it's a pretty good book.